Hi everyone, Ruben Di Norena here, and this is a very special episode. I'm joined by my dear friend Tim Campbell, and we have a very special guest today, Bob McDonald, who is the former chairman and CEO of Procter & Gamble, and was also selected by President Obama as the 8th Secretary of Veteran Affairs. So to start off, Bob, talk us through some more about your background, who you are, and what has got you to where you are today.
Well, I was born in Gary, Indiana, which for those who know the United States is a steel town. I was born in a house across from the U.S. Steel Mill. When I was young, I wanted to go to West Point. So I first applied when I was in 6th grade. They obviously don't take you until your junior year of high school. But I entered West Point in 1971. I graduated in 1975. And even though I graduated toward the top of my class academically, I decided I wanted to go in the infantry. So I became what's in the U.S. Army is called an Airborne Ranger Infantry Officer. Went to the 82nd Airborne Division and served there and in the 18th Airborne Corps for 5 years. During that time, I got an MBA at night and on the weekends. And when I left the military, I had an MBA, but I had an undergraduate degree in engineering. Interviewed with a number of companies and joined the Procter & Gamble company in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1980. Spent 33 years there, worked in Cincinnati, then in Toronto, Canada, then in Manila in the Philippines, then in Kobe, Japan, then Brussels, Belgium, then back to Cincinnati. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I ended up retiring as the chairman, president, and CEO. Shortly thereafter, I got a call from the White House, and President Obama asked me to take over the Department of Veterans Affairs, which is the second largest department in the federal government. There was a bit of a scandal. Some veterans weren't getting the care that they needed. As you know, we had been fighting a war for a number of years. The previous secretary had resigned, and I came in to try to right the ship. And that was a great honor to do that.
Well, you've had a number of different experiences there you've whizzed through, and I just love how easily you drop in there. You got a call from the White House. Many of us would never know what that experience was like. So I love how humble you are in your explanation of your achievement. Do you think humility is really important for leadership?
Oh, absolutely. It's a great question, Tim. And I think humility is an incredibly important part of leadership. I clearly benefited from the fact that my first leadership experience was as an infantry officer in the Army. I had a platoon of about 30 airborne qualified soldiers. We deployed quite a bit. We went to the jungles of Panama. We went to the Arctic Circle. And during that time, you realize you're all the same. I mean, one of the things we talk about at West Point is you have to learn to follow before you can learn to lead. And when your life is in danger, as it is when you parachute, I never served in combat, but when you parachute or when you're in a live fire exercise, you grow to rely on other people, and that reliance creates humility. It also creates empathy. And from that empathy comes intimacy, and from that intimacy comes trust. Once you've been together with a bunch of guys at the Arctic Circle, it's 70 degrees below zero. There's no daylight. You know that if somebody falls asleep, they'll freeze and die. It's you have this sense of care for each other that transcends any moment. It was interesting because knowing that from the military, when I got to business, I tried to create that feeling of togetherness, that empathy, that humility, that intimacy, that trust. In fact, the word trust is one of Procter & Gamble's 5 values. Trust. It's important in the organization. Without the extreme circumstances. In other words, in business, you're not going to jump out of an airplane with a parachute.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. So you don't have that in extremis circumstance, yet that trust becomes very important.
So when people are thinking about diversity and inclusion, because that's a huge part of the world of business now, how you wonderfully explained it there around being reliant on your fellow man, because you knew that they were going to protect you, they were going to look after you. It came from a place of love, which led into that trust, etc. Do you think that therefore some of the issues in business today are because there is a lack of trust amongst people in their workplace? Are they too focused on just the commercial success, not about the culture, the inclusiveness of organizations?
Well, I think you hit on a very important point. When I trained leadership at the Procter and Gamble Company and elsewhere, I would tell people I can train you in the mechanical behaviors, which when observed from afar, people say, well, that's leadership. What I can't necessarily train you in is to love the people you work with. And if you don't love the people you work with, those behaviors will come off as inauthentic. And there's nothing worse than lacking authenticity. So love is a very important concept. Now, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, I think a couple of things. First of all, I'm a big believer in Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And Stephen, who I had the joy of training with or training from, talks about when you're a child, you're dependent. Your parents diaper you, your parents feed you. As you grow up, you become a teenager, you want to be independent. You want to prove to your parents you don't need them. You want the keys to the car. You know, you don't need anybody. You can be by yourself. But when you graduate to a higher level, you realize you can't accomplish anything of value unless you work interdependently. You need other people. Nothing can be done by yourself. You need other people. Well, because you need other people, I really believe that inclusiveness becomes a got to have. It's not a strategy. It's a must. So at the Procter and Gamble Company, as an example, we want our employee group to look like and represent the people that they serve. One of the things I did as a chairman of the board was every director I added to the board was a woman. So we got up to 50% directors as women. Well, the majority of our products are used by women. That just makes sense. You know, we would go in and we would hire people all around the world. And I saw recruiting as a big part of my job. I spent a lot of time doing it. But you need that inclusiveness, and not just hiring the people, but then having systems and mechanisms within the company to listen to them and to harvest their ideas and nurture their ideas. And one of my beliefs is that diversity and inclusion leads to better innovation. In other words, if you want innovation, which for the Procter and Gamble Company, we say innovation is our lifeblood. I said this at the VA as well. If our purpose at the Procter and Gamble Company is to improve lives, well, innovation is the way we improve lives. So you need innovation. Well, that innovation comes from these diverse sources, these people with different experiences. So you want them, not only recruit them and hire them, but you want to create a culture that allows them to bring themselves to the office. Now, this idea about innovation came to me actually from a British author, Professor James Burke, who I think taught at Cambridge, created a television series and wrote a book called Connections. And his basic point was inventions never end up getting used for what they were designed for. He talks about Alexander Graham Bell inventing the telephone, but he invented it as a hearing aid for a deaf school that he worked at. He didn't expect it to become the telephone that we know today. Certainly didn't expect a cell phone. Marconi invented the radio, for 2 ships to communicate at sea. He never expected the radio to come on land. And then my favorite from James Burke is Thomas Watson, who was the founder of IBM, said someday the US may need 2 or 3 computers, which sounds funny and fanciful now, but in those days, the computer was used to take the census of the country and not for all of the various things we do today. So yes, you want a diverse organization. You want to be inclusive. You need to create a culture to allow those people to bring themselves to the office and then use their ideas for innovation.
Wonderful. I'll hand over to Ruben.
So over your time, over 33 years at Procter & Gamble, on this point of leadership, what advice would you have for people just starting out, or people potentially lower in the organization, on learning to become better leaders, as someone who's gone through the ranks and rose up to eventually become chairman and CEO?
Well, my advice would be get as much practice as you can the younger you are. Again, I was very fortunate that when I graduated from West Point, I had 4 years of leadership experience at West Point. And that was very valuable leadership experience, because that was leadership experience of my classmates. I was in a leadership position in the Corps of Cadets. I had to lead my classmates. So you're leading without authority. And in a way, leading without authority is the best practice for leadership with authority, because as a lieutenant, even though I had legal authority over the soldiers in my unit, if I ever had to really use that authority, rather than simply implying or inferring it, you really lose your moral center. So I had the great opportunity to have all of these leadership experiences at a very, very young age. The second thing I would say to your listeners is be an insatiable learner. As life goes on, things around you change, and you need to change too. People mistake that Darwin said that the fit survive, and the reality is he said the adaptable survive. All of us need to adapt, and the older you get, the harder it is to learn new things. So what you want to do is look for things you don't understand, look for things you don't know, uh, get a reverse mentor and someone younger than you, and continually work to new things. What differentiates, in my opinion, those who succeed at the Procter & Gamble company, or at the Department of Veterans Affairs, or in business, and maybe all in life, is the ability to learn new things along the way. It's incredibly important. And then if I can say one more thing, my third thing would be develop a purpose. Understand what your purpose is in life, and don't be bashful. Don't worry that you might not get it right the first time, but go through a deliberate exercise of understanding what your purpose is, write it down, and then keep nurturing it throughout your life. It's better to lead a life inspired by a purpose than it is to meander through life without direction.
Yeah, that's so true. And on your point about leading a life guided by a purpose, what would you say your purpose is, and did it evolve over time? And also, what advice do you have to anyone listening who wants to find their purpose? Because there's so many different opportunities nowadays. It's quite hard to sometimes discern what you want to do. So, what advice would you have there?
It's a great question, Ruben. I think the best place to start is to sit down and maybe write down the journey map of your life. In other words, start with your birth, and then take a line and write down all the cathartic experiences you've had in life, and maybe what you've learned from them. And where you've faced a fork in the road, think about, why did I take that decision? And look for threads of continuity. Okay, so when I was young, I said in sixth grade, I applied to go to West Point. Ironically, my congressman, even though I couldn't be nominated to go in sixth grade, 11 years old, my congressman encouraged me to continue to apply. And his name was Donald Rumsfeld. And I've told Secretary Rumsfeld many times, thank you for not discouraging a young person. But as I went through that experience, I was trying to decide, what was the goal? Was the goal to simply go to West Point? Was the goal to become a career Army officer? What was the goal? And then as I look back through my life and I looked at things that I really enjoyed doing, like Boy Scouts, like service projects, like church projects, the thread of continuity was working to improve the lives of others. So when it came time to get out of the service, I thought, I've got to find a company where I can continue to work to improve the lives of others, a company which is purpose inspired, a company which is value based, and a company whose people live that purpose and values every day.
And Procter and Gamble were very lucky to have you. It's interesting. You everything you've been saying, I've been like, this is he's gonna think I'm making it up. The book I look Stephen Covey, The Speed of Trust, and then one of my other favorite books is around purpose. So
Yep.
it's amazing. It's like music to our ears. But I suppose picking up on all of those things, having a such a long and successful career with a
Well, wait,
global,
Tim,
fantastic.
Tim, I'm not successful. I'm a work in process, and I'm still on my journey. And I don't think success is an endpoint. I think success is a journey.
Yep.
Particularly if you're making a difference in the lives of others during that journey.
Yep. I think that once again, I think that plays to the humility of you as a man. So that's thank you for sharing that. But I suppose I'm looking at it from you're getting phone calls from lovely places with amazing leaders who are calling you to assist them in their journey. And the humility of that is explained by what you say, but also having worked in a corporate for over 30 years and then leveraging all of that knowledge, experience, the education into helping the generation of those who sacrifice so much for our benefits. That is great. But what do you take away from some of that learning that you've seen, working with those veteran communities, working with those organizations and those leaders, in the light of the way that the world of business is changing so rapidly now? Technology, artificial intelligence, you talk about Watson and IBM, the influence that artificial learning and other aspects of machine learning are going to have on our way of working now are amazing.
Yeah.
How do you talk to the next generation about how they should navigate that world?
Yeah, you're asking very insightful questions. That's a great question, because the risk is you think that the machine and the AI and all of those other things are really what drives the success of your organization, rather than the relationships that you build. And what I worry about, particularly in a coronavirus human separation context, relationships are the most important thing in life. For me, relationships are the reason we're here. First is my relationship with my God. Second is my relationship with my family, those I love. And third is my relationship with friends. And those relationships are what turn me on. They're what animate me. I mean, I loved coming to work every single day at the Procter and Gamble company or at the Department of Veterans Affairs. And the reason I did was because of the relationships. The relationships were everything. So leadership is time inefficient. It just is. Imagine you're in your office. This happens many times. It's right before a holiday of some sort. You're going away with your family. Somebody comes in the door and says, "We really need to talk." What are you going to do? Or when I was Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs, my first national press conference in the fall of 2014, I gave out my cell phone number. It's still my cell phone number. You can find it on the internet, because I felt like veterans needed someone they could trust, somebody they could call, kind of an ombudsman of the last resort to get the care they need.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to do that, my expectation is everyone else in the organization is going to do that. Those relationships are absolutely critical. And I hope we never forget that. And what we've got to do is we've got to find new ways to create them, because those relationships lead to the trust that Stephen M. R. Covey writes about in his book, and that we talked about earlier. I remember this is 1991. I was general manager of Procter & Gamble in the Philippines. So this is before the internet. And my manager says to me, "Well, in addition to your job running the business in the Philippines, which I think is about $1 billion business today, we would like you to also run the hair care business throughout Asia." Okay. And I thought, great, love to do that. Now, here's the challenge. Throughout Asia was from Korea in the north to Australia in the south, from India in the west to Japan in the east. All right. Well, I had read the book in 1984 called In Search of Excellence. You may have heard of it. And the book talks about managing by walking around. Well, how can you walk around Asia? You can't, right? So how do you create new methods of creating intimacy with those you work with, new methods of creating trust without the ability of being geographically concentrated? That's the same kind of thing we have now with COVID, and also with the technology that we benefit from. We can't forget about human relationships.
And I think that's from a leadership perspective, that can be incredibly difficult, because not only have you got to deal with the culture of your organization, you may have to deal with the geographical cultural differences, because the Manila conversation is very different from the conversation you may have in Mumbai. It's so hard. How did you encourage yourself as a leader to be open to those varieties, and instead of seeing the cultural difference as something to navigate, something to benefit for what you were trying to achieve?
Well, I had the benefit of living and working abroad, whether it was a tank platoon in Germany I had in the Army, whether it was being with Inuits in the Arctic Circle, whether it was living in the Philippines or Japan. And in each one of those cases, thank you to the Procter & Gamble company, I tried to learn the language, but more importantly, I tried to learn the culture. And then I tried to live in a community that was a local community rather than a community of expatriates. And when I became in charge of the Procter & Gamble company, it was clear that this cultural diversity that we had was a gift, and that to the degree we could celebrate it, we would be a more innovative company. So we actually had culture days where people would come in, they would bring their national costume, they would bring their national culture, and we would set up booths where others could experience it. And the idea was to teach the employees that you've got to be a student of culture. You've got, if I'm going to go into your home and watch you and then develop a new product from the insights I gain, I've got to develop that skill to look for those insights. I'll give you an example. In 2005, we bought the Gillette company. I think it was about an $85 billion acquisition. It was the largest acquisition at the time. And we discovered that they had developed a razor for developing markets for men that wasn't doing very well. And so we thought, well, how did this happen? And it was basically, they were trying it in India. And what we discovered was that they had sent their researchers to MIT and found some Indian students, and then were concerned about Indian physiology in developing this razor. Wow. We changed it. We sent a team to Mumbai, who sat on the floor with the man in the morning, watched him get the water in his what was a vegetable can that he filled with water, tried to shave. And what we discovered, of course, was he couldn't rinse the razor because he didn't have running water. In fact, in some communities in the developing world, water is more expensive than just about anything else. So we designed a new razor, but you've got to have those intimate experiences if you expect to learn from them.
I was on mute. Thank you for sharing that, Ruben. I was handing over to you.
Oh, sorry. I think it just cut off a bit. So what advice do you have for continuing on that journey to improve? Because I've heard you say that never striving for a title like CEO. So how do you balance that with actually wanting to do well? And what advice do you have for people that want to get higher in the organization, but for a good reason?
Yeah, I think the task when you're younger and less experienced is to do the best job you can at the job you've been given, and through that prove that you're ready for the next level. I mean, I remember we always used to think that we knew someone was ready to be promoted when they were behaving consistent with the behavior required at the next level. On the other hand, I'd see lots of people who could perform well at a level, but then when you move them up, new skills were required and they couldn't adapt or learn those new skills. So to be clear, my statement was, don't undersell yourself by setting a goal as a title, by your goal being a title, whether it's CEO or vice president or whatever, because number one, at least in the Procter & Gamble company, by the time you're ready for that, we may have reorganized the company and that job doesn't exist. Or number two, you're going to focus so much on that title, on that position, that you're going to lose sight of the job you're supposed to be doing. So have a purpose that is about something like improving lives or making a difference in people's lives, not a title or a position, which I think doesn't have enough substance.
Do you worry that there is a generation, without being ageist, a generation that is focused on lots of the materialistic elements of work or careers, as opposed to that intrinsic purpose? Because for us, Ruben and I, as God-fearing individuals, we have a very driven purpose around wanting to support our fellow man and make sure that we live in the teachings and the followings of Christ. But I don't know, in the world of business, that's always seemed to be compatible, because shareholder profit, driving and competing against your competitor, some of the industry sectors that you would have touched on were very, pun intended, cutthroat when you think about the world of razors and other things. Mm-hmm. And how did you always tally that with your drive around being a man of faith?
Well, I think it's a good question. It's a tough question. I think the thing I tried to do was to maintain perspective. I mean, the risk in any of these jobs is you become very myopic. And one of the things I learned in Japan is you can't outwork a job. In other words, in the Japanese culture, there's a word for working yourself to death, literally killing yourself. And we had 4 or 5 years of declining business, and people were working harder, doing the same thing. And what we had to do was turn the lights off at night, lock the building up, force people to take vacation. We had people not taking vacation. And of course, because they were so myopic, they weren't getting the external stimulus required to know their consumer, to get insights from their consumer, and to be innovative to design new products for their consumers. So I think trying to maintain that distance becomes very important. And of course, having time each day, each week, to come back to what's really important to you, maybe through prayer, through Bible study and worship, helps provide that distance as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think the topic of faith and business, I mean, one of my previous episodes of the podcast was on that topic, and it's so important. So thank you for sharing.
Well, I would encourage you to look at a website of an organization I'm on the advisory board of called Just Capital, JUST Capital. And basically they do a survey each year, and they rate companies on the kind of capitalism they represent. In other words, are they taking care of the environment? Do they have an inclusive culture? And so forth. And I'm proud that the Procter & Gamble company is first in its industry and in the top 10 in the world. But that's the kind of company it is. And here's what I would argue, guys, and this is counterintuitive. The Procter & Gamble company has been around for nearly 200 years because it's done business that way. I think that's the way you become a sustainable company. If you look at the Fortune 50 from 1955, only 9 of the companies are still on that list. P&G is one of them. Why? Because P&G, to use a West Point phrase, has chosen the harder right rather than the easier wrong throughout its history.
Very good. And with the prevalence of regulators looking at ESG from organizations now, it's a huge concern for investors who want to put their capital to work in things that are going to be sustainable. We have to
Yes.
be aware that we were blessed with one place to live, and sometimes we have to think about that place and the incumbents within it, and making sure that we're doing something that is
Absolutely.
sustainable.
In fact, let me tell you a brief story. In 1980, when I joined Procter & Gamble, Ed Harness was our CEO. We developed a product called Rely, which was a female's tampon to be used for menstruation, to control menstruation. And at that time, there was a terrible disease going around the country called toxic shock syndrome, TSS. And TSS was potentially caused by the tampon being so effective that it was blocking airflow and other things inside the woman, and bacteria were developing and multiplying quickly. So Ed Harness, we were under attack from various regulatory agencies. Ed Harness called the scientists in, and the scientists prepared for their meeting with Ed by going and finding that people were dying of toxic shock syndrome who did not use the Rely tampon. Ed said, guys, ladies, you're answering the wrong question. The question I want to know is, did anyone who died of toxic shock syndrome use the Rely tampon? And of course, someone had. So he made the decision to withdraw the product from the market. I think we took like a $300 million write-off. Our stock price fell in half. We were afraid we were going to be bought by a Japanese company. But it's those kinds of moves that become part of the culture and that help create a culture of choosing the harder right rather than easier wrong, which is part of the West Point Cadet Prayer, that causes an organization to sustain itself over a long period of time.
And I suppose an unfair question then is the culture the responsibility of the leader and the leadership board, or is it built up from the bottom up by the people who are working for the vehicle? Where does that come?
Great question, Tim. I would argue that the culture is the responsibility of the leader and the leadership, and that culture needs to be worked on deliberately. If you go to a online or library or wherever, and you look up books on leadership, you'll find tens and tens of thousands of them, like the books on your shelf. If you go look for books on culture development and culture leadership, you'll find very few. It's a very difficult thing to do. But how do you do it? Well, for example, at P&G, we created a P&G museum. So we had important documents, we had important artifacts. And if you were a new hire or recruit, we would always take you through the P&G museum. It was important you learned about this Ed Harness Rely tampon example, for example. Or if you ever had to do research on a business decision, you could always go there to find things. Taboos. We had to say, what's taboo, what's not? What do you reinforce? What do you give awards for? Do you give awards for innovation? Do you give awards for inclusion? Do you give awards for diversity? In that picture, what does everybody look like? Do they all look the same, or do they look like the consumers we serve? On the walls of the building, do we have great pieces of art done by French painters? No, we have pictures of consumers using our products because they're the heroes. They're the ones we're trying to get close to. They're the ones we're trying to. So those are some ways you create culture. I told my group at the VA that I can walk into a factory or an office and know if it's a high performance organization. I look for two things. Is there any trash on the floor? And are people walking by the trash and not picking it up? Second thing, if I go in the restroom, is there water around the edge of the sink? Or are people so respectful of the next person coming in that they're drying up that water and leaving the area pristine for them?
Wow.
These are little cultural things that you can pick up.
Wow.
In the military, do the soldiers shave every day, for example?
And it's one of those things. Well, firstly, I need you to come to my house and help my son learn about wiping down the sinks. That's the first one, and that we worth £1,000,000 in its own right. But then I suppose the second thing is that it's those little gems that then build up to a bigger picture. And I think it's from the veteran's perspective, it's why you learn to make your bed. If you can do that properly, you can do everything else properly, and it sets the tone for everything you got. And that's a great gem, I suppose, for that next generation of leader who is thinking far off in the distance. Start where you are, now what you're doing now, and then that will build into that is such a gem. Thank you for
Tim, you're right. I guess you've read Admiral McRaven's speech, which is and book. It's a good one. Here's the point. You can't create a disciplined organization unless you're self-disciplined yourself, right? And so the question becomes, if you really are interested in being a great leader, what are you doing to develop yourself? What are your habits? How do you take, how do you do self-discipline? How do you create positive habits? What book are you reading? Who are you learning from? What new thing are you learning that you didn't know? These are all things that lead to great leadership.
Well, just quickly, something that I ask a lot of guests that come on the podcast is, what books have really mostly influenced their lives? You've referenced quite a few so far, but I was wondering if you could talk through some books that have greatly influenced your life.
Well, one of the things I do, or I started doing about 30 years ago, is I create a list of my leadership beliefs. There are 10 of them. I keep it at that length to keep it short. I basically look at the cathartic experiences in life. From that, I helicopter up, figure out what the belief is. And they're often animated by a book I read. So for example, this whole idea of purpose and the centrality of purpose in life was reinforced by a book I read by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. Now it's an unfortunate title. I'd like women to read it too. But he was a prisoner in Auschwitz concentration camp, and he kept people alive by focusing on a vision of the future rather than looking back in the past. He developed a whole school of psychology for that. So that obviously was a very big one. Obviously another one was 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, Stephen M.R. Covey's father. Stephen M.R. Covey's book, Trust, The Speed of Trust, is another great book. I basically get my hands on everything I can because I'm sure there's something out there that I don't know that I want to learn. A book was just published last week called The Character Edge.
Okay.
And at West Point, we talk about developing leaders of character. That's purposeful. You can be a leader without character, and you will eventually fail. And we've seen a lot of leaders without character. What we need is leaders of character, and that's the kind of leaders at Procter & Gamble, the kind of leaders at the VA. It was written by my West Point classmate and former superintendent of West Point, Lieutenant General Bob Caslin. It's a great book.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. And to kind of conclude now, one of the questions I ask everyone who comes on is this hypothetical question. So if it was many years from now and it's the last day for you, and the books that you've read, like the social media posts that you've put out, your leadership principles, all of that is erased for some reason, and you can write down three things of everything you know about life, business, or whatever it may be. So 3 things that you would leave to the world of your biggest lessons. What would those 3 things be for you?
Well, number 1 is live a life of purpose rather than meandering through life without direction. Wouldn't it be terrible to get to the end of life and look back and realize you didn't really focus on anything of value? Number 2 would be choose the harder right rather than the easier wrong, from the West Point Cadet Prayer. That collection of words has helped me throughout my life. If you're doing something and it feels easy to do, get skeptical, because it's probably the wrong thing to do. Number 3 would be be an insatiable learner, as we talked earlier. Learn everything you can. If you hear a word you don't know, write it down, look it up. If you see somebody programming some software, you're not familiar with it, look it up. Continue learning, and that's the way you increase your value to humanity.
Love that. What are you grateful for, Bob?
You know, grateful people are happy people. I am grateful for all of the opportunities I've been given in life. I watched a movie a week ago or so, and there was a statement in there. It was attributed to Albert Einstein, but I researched it and I'm not sure he ever said it. Nevertheless, I give him credit for it. But coincidences are God's way of being anonymous. And when I look back through my life and look at it this way, I went to West Point. I served in an elite military unit. I went to the Procter & Gamble company, where I learned about serving the 5 billion people on the planet who use at least one P&G product a day, and learned about human-centered design, all the ways to improve the way we serve them. And then there was a crisis at the VA, and I was asked by the President of the United States to get these veterans, the 20 million veterans in the country, the care they deserve. All of those preceding life experiences built to that last one. That's why I say I don't know what's next, but I'm really excited to find out.
Oh, well, we've been excited to talk to you and learn from some really insightful answers to our questions. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Ruben. I'll do everything I can to advertise and make people aware of your podcast on my website.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Ruben. It's great to be with you.
You
Take care.
too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.